Major funding for this program was provided by the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, the Dean Rusk Center at the University of Georgia School of Law, Dr. Jerome Tannenbaum and DSI Facility Development, and the Center for International Governance Innovation. Additional funding was provided by these contributors.
Good morning. I'm Charlie Battle, Chairman of the Southern Center for International Studies, and we are especially proud to have been able to partner with the Dean Rusk Center at the Georgia Law School in co-hosting this event. We're grateful for the support that Rebecca White, Dean of the Law School, and Don Johnson, Director of the Center, have given to us. As Don told you, it's very appropriate that we are here today co-hosting this event with them because Dean Rusk, among his many accomplishments, was a chairman for many years of the Southern Center, was very instrumental in beginning this series and participated in many of them. So without further ado, I'd like to ask you to join me in giving a very warm Georgia welcome to our distinguished panel for today's discussion. Secretary Henry Kissinger, Secretary Warren Christopher, our moderator Terence Smith, Secretary James Baker, Secretary Madeleine Albright, and Secretary Colin Powell. Thank you very much.
I'm Terence Smith, and welcome to the 16th report of the former Secretaries of State brought to you by the Southern Center for International Studies and the University of Georgia School of Law. The program is being held in commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the Dean Rusk Center for International Law. Joining us today in Athens, Georgia, are 5 former Secretaries of State. 3 served in Republican administrations, 2 in Democratic. Henry Kissinger, who served under Presidents Nixon and Ford, James Baker, under the George H.W. Bush administration, Colin Powell, who served during the current Bush administration's first term, Warren Christopher, who served during President Clinton's first term, and Madeleine Albright, who served in President Clinton's second term. Our goal here today is to tap the wisdom and extraordinary experience that we have around this table and provide some bipartisan foreign policy advice to the next administration. Polls suggest that over half of the world's citizens believe the U.S. is playing a mainly negative role in the world, and that less than a third feel that the U.S. role is largely positive. So the question, what can or should a new president, Secretary Powell, let me put this to you, do to repair the U.S. image abroad?
Our image abroad has dropped significantly in recent years. The administration has gained the reputation of speaking too harshly, backing out of international agreements and things of this nature. I think it will begin to change with a new president, no matter which of these 3 candidates win. You get a reset at that time. And if that new president begins by reaching out to all of our friends and allies around the world, and not only convey our points of view and what we believe in, but listen and hear what we are listening to, actually hear it and act on it, and show that kind of comity to other nations in the world, will begin to turn that around.
You're suggesting that we haven't listened very well?
We haven't listened as well as we might have. One point I do want to make, though. There is still a solid reservoir of respect and affection for the United States of America. I think all of my colleagues would agree with me when I tell you that at every consular office this morning, there is a line throughout our system. And when people get to the front of that line and they look across that counter to our consular office, they all say the same thing: I want to go to America. So I think that the situation we find ourselves in now is reversible, and that will begin with a new president. I think there are some things the new president can do right away that will begin to return us to a more favorable position. For example, close Guantanamo immediately. And by closing Guantanamo, saying to the world, we are now going to go back to our traditional respected forms of dealing with people who have potentially committed crimes.
Because you believe that's been damaging to the U.S.
It has been very damaging.
All right. Secretary Albright, do you agree with that? That's a task for the new president?
Absolutely. I personally have never seen the world in such a mess. I am the youngest one up here, so the others may disagree with me. But
it's cruel of you to point that out.
But I don't think I have ever seen it like this, and I think that the next president is going to have a very big job. I think a lot of it does have to do with our actions, and Colin, I think, has described those. But also, you asked, what does it matter to us? And I think it matters in the following way, since the President and the Secretaries of State job is to protect the national security of the United States. It hurts us if we are so disregarded or maligned because we're not able to get the kind of support we need for whatever the issues are, whether they are going into Afghanistan or dealing with the financial crisis or dealing with climate change issues. And so it does matter, not whether we're loved. I don't care whether we're loved or not. I think, though, we need to be respected and not necessarily just feared for doing the wrong thing. And I would hope that one of the first things that the next president would do would not only close Guantanamo, and I totally agree on that, but also make very clear that we will rejoin or lead an effort on climate change, because that's part of what has to happen.
Secretary Baker?
I think it's regrettable, frankly, that Madeleine is so young that she didn't live through the Cold War, because the world was not an happy place to be in during that period of time. But on the other hand, I agree with you completely that the next president should lead an effort among the nations to try and do something about climate change. A lot of the problems that face the country today are not discrete with respect to specific areas of the world. They are transnational problems dealing with terrorism and global climate change and trade and economic issues, and that's what the kind of thing the next president's going to have to deal with.
Secretary Christopher, tell us your view and tell us as well your view on Secretary Powell's suggestion on Guantanamo.
I'm one of those who thinks that in order to be strong abroad, we have to be strong at home, not militarily, but economically as well. And I see our domestic economy as a severe problem for us around the world. The weak American dollar is a kind of a metaphor for me for the weakness of America abroad, and that's beginning to hurt very badly. And I think one of the things the new president ought to do is to try to get our economic house in order. When I joined the Clinton administration in 1993, we were in economic doldrums at that time, and countries like Japan were kind of raising eyebrows about our condition over here and wondering if we could manage our economy and execute the questions around the world. After the Congress passed the Deficit Reduction Act in 1993 by a one-vote margin, I just found a real perceptible effect on my ability to be effective abroad, because once again the United States had credibility. On Guantanamo, Terry, I agree completely with Colin Powell.
I would like to add that I do think that our image abroad has, in recent months at least, made a little bit of progress. I know the current...
Why do you think?
Because the current administration, both the President and the Secretary of State, have exerted extra efforts to try and repair some of those relationships. And I'm not denying the fact that the 50% figure is accurate. I think it is. With respect to Guantanamo, let me say I totally agree with what Colin and Madeleine and Chris have said. I think it ought to be closed, and I think it gives us a very, very bad name, not just internationally. And maybe this is because I'm a lawyer, but I have a great deal of difficulty understanding how we can hold someone pick somebody up, particularly someone who might be an American citizen, and hold them without ever giving them an opportunity to appear before a magistrate and say yes or no, or prove that they're not an enemy combatant, if you will. But that's a legal argument. But anyway, I think we ought to close it.
Let me add one postscript to that. None of us are suggesting these people should be turned loose.
No.
We're suggesting they ought to be brought into our established legal system to face charges and be given access to the writ of habeas corpus and lawyers and whatever else we give to citizens.
Secretary Kissinger, do you agree with that?
I agree with the impact that Guantanamo has internationally.
The negative impact.
The negative impact. And I would like to see it closed. But I would also like to see what the alternative is, because some of the people would be very hard to put into an American judicial system. I'd like to know what one does in situations in which there's a clear threat to the security of the United States.
I don't think any of us are suggesting either that these people, the vast majority of them, ought to be given the constitutional protections of an American citizen. We're not suggesting that.
Secretary Albright, you want to add
more
something?
to the point as to the dangers in the world. I lived through the Cold War, and I have no nostalgia for it. What I think is, though, in a strange way, it was more rational. And there was the sense that there was some control over how we dealt with nuclear weapons. The problem that we have now, and it goes a little bit to what Henry was saying, there are non-state actors that we don't know how to leverage our power against. We have the problem of the proliferation of nuclear technology, and then a whole host of issues that are harder to handle for the international system. I think that as we look to the next presidency, I think it's going to be difficult in the fact that the international system that we've all grown up with is out of kilter, and that the organizations are strained, and that the alliance structures don't quite work the way we thought they would. Instead of living in the past, it's going to take a different approach where the United States understands that we have to operate in a different kind of a system. And I think it's going to take a lot of work of the next president, whoever that person is.
Let us turn to topic number one for the new president, whoever he or she may be, the Iraq War. A little bit of background. In March 2003, the U.S. and its allies invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein. Since then, however, 4,000 Americans and possibly hundreds of thousands of Iraqis have been killed. Over 4 million Iraqis have fled their homes. Despite a January 2007 surge, bloodshed continues. So let's talk about the choices that will confront the new president in January of 2009. What's a strategy? Secretary Christopher?
2.5 months before the war, I wrote an op-ed piece opposing the war. Let me just read a couple of sentences from that, if I might. Even if the optimistic predictions of quick victory proved to be accurate, we would find ourselves then absorbed with the occupation of Iraq and efforts to impose democracy on the fractious elements of that country. It seems to me that after 5 years, we've had, from the White House, Iraq on the front burner, Iraq all the time, and I think for the health of our country, we need to get past that now. Secretary Baker led a commission that prescribed some very good remedies in that situation, which unfortunately have not been taken, and I look forward to the discussion around the table about how we do get out of this. I hope we learn the right lessons from this very tragic adventure that we've had abroad, and so I hope whatever the outcome here, that we'll find ways to stay engaged in the world. But before we take an adventure like this again, we're very careful to have thought through the adventure and to have an exit strategy underway.
Let me turn to Secretary Baker and quote something from the Iraq study group, which you co-chaired, in which the report read, of all the neighbors of Iraq, Iran has the most leverage in Iraq and could help bring about stability. The report recommends that Iran be actively engaged without preconditions. So should the new administration approach Iran, and how?
Our report recommended that we start talking to Iran in the same way we talked to Iran about Afghanistan, about our common interest in a stable Afghanistan after we went in there, and Iran helped us and cooperated a little bit with us. Colin can amplify on that. We need to do the same thing with respect to Iraq. That's what our Iraq Study Group report suggested, because a dysfunctional Iraq, chaotic Iraq, is not something that is in the interest of Iran. They don't want that. They'll have a ton of refugees, so there's every incentive on their part to help us the same way they did in Afghanistan if we're willing to approach them without preconditions. Now, they may not do it, but what do you lose by giving it a shot?
All right. Does anyone disagree with that?
I agree with Jim that one has to talk to adversaries, but one should not treat it as a psychiatric problem. So that it's just a question of going into a room and creating goodwill. How well we negotiate with Iran depends in part on the objective balances that exist in the region. The reason it worked when Colin was Secretary is because we had a force in Afghanistan. We were changing the situation, but we recognized that Afghanistan could not be solved without the participation of the neighbors. And in that context, it was possible to get an agreement. If Iran considers itself a significant country that wants to be respected, we ought to find a mode of negotiation. Because if things get tougher, we have to be able to tell to the American people that we have done everything we can to explore a peaceful evolution of the region.
Secretary Christopher, you wanted to say something else?
I just wanted to add a footnote with respect to Iran. I have a few scars for trying to negotiate with Iran over a 14-month period. And one of the lessons I bring back from that is that there are many vectors of power. Too often we think of Iran in terms of President Ahmadinejad, and we fail to take into account the importance of the clerics, leaders like Khomeini, and longtime leaders like Rafsanjani. So I think we need to explore every one of those vectors of power to try to find an opening, and over time we need to have a comprehensive dialogue with Iran, because if we talk about only those things we want to talk about, that might freeze the negotiations.
Secretary Powell.
I would like to align myself with the position that says we should reach out and begin talks with Iran. In the first term of the administration, I was talking to the Syrians on a regular basis. I went to Damascus several times. They're not always pleasant visits, but you got to do it. And sometimes you achieved an objective. Sometimes it was just an exchange of views, but you stayed in touch with these folks. And we kept low-level conversations going on with the Iranians through 2003. And then subsequently that fell apart, and then we stopped talking to the Syrians. The Syrians and the Iranians live in that neighborhood. They're an essential part of any solution, and we have to find ways of talking to them. On Iraq itself, if I may, the United States Army and the United States Marine Corps that cannot keep up this level of deployment. It is a serious problem. And so my best judgment is that no matter what is being said right now, the drawdown will have to continue, if for no other reason than it is not sustainable with the size military that we have. The other thing that I would like to say is that Al-Qaeda is in Iraq. It wasn't there before, but it is now. But even if you got rid of Al-Qaeda totally, you have the basic underlying problem, which is not Al-Qaeda. There is a conflict taking place between the Shias and the Sunnis, and within the Shias, for power and survival and for control of the country. And there's just so much we can do with the United States Armed Forces to resolve that conflict or even contain it. The Baker-Hamilton report discussed this in considerable detail and had advocated a policy of let's start disengaging somewhat, not go away, not cut and run. And no president will find that to be an acceptable policy. I don't think it's sustainable for 140 or 150,000 American soldiers to just sit there forever, fighting Shias one day, fighting Sunnis the next day. It has to be passed off to the Iraqis, because all the crises we are talking about now are from this administration to the next. I can assure you that there are several crises awaiting the new administration shortly after they take over.
Secretary Albright.
I teach a course, and I say to my students that foreign policy is just trying to get some other country to do what you want, and that you basically, the new president will come in and open the national security toolbox and figure out what is the appropriate blend of force and diplomacy. Because, as Secretary Powell was saying, it's very hard for us to stay there. But we also have to figure out how to use the United Nations on the sanctions, how to find what we have in common with the Iranians, because we do. It's a big lesson as to how we dig ourselves out of this hole of Iraq, and a bad reputation has to do with using all the tools in the toolbox.
Much of what has just been said by Colin and Madeleine is called for in the 50-page Iraq Study Group report. This was a bipartisan commission, and we debated a lot, exactly what's being debated now in our presidential campaign, whether or not to set a date. Set a date for withdrawal, a date to begin, a date for... We refused to do that. I think that one of the worst things we could do when we start thinking about Iraq is to somehow say, well, we need to get out of there come what may. We're going to have to draw down. That is going to have to happen, but that's far different than setting a date and a precipitous withdrawal. With respect to Syria, if you look at the Iraq Study Group report, our commission thought we could flip Syria. If the United States made it clear to them that we could bring them back into the community of nations, if you will, and they could get on semi-good terms again with the United States, we could flip them away from Iran. That may be something, hopefully it will be something that the new president will want to try and do, and really do it aggressively.
There's another quote from the Iraq Study Group report that moves us a little bit. It says, the United States cannot achieve its goals in the Middle East unless it deals directly with the Arab-Israeli conflict. So the question is, do you agree with that? And what is it that you envision would come of that, Secretary Kissinger?
As a practical matter, one has to involve the Europeans and the moderate Arabs in order to get guarantees for the security aspects that have to be part of such an agreement. I think the borders and the Arab part of Jerusalem should be part of the settlement. It's tacitly understood. There'll still be big disagreements about it. But I think the outline of the agreement is pretty clear. Two unsettled issues are, is it possible for the return of refugees to be limited to the Palestinian side? And secondly, what is the security arrangement that prevents a outbreak in the Palestinian state of events like Gaza? And that cannot be done by the local people alone. That requires some kind of international presence or agreement.
Well, Secretary Christopher, you talked earlier about needing to deal with difficult groups. Would you apply that to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to non-state groups that nonetheless are big players in this whole equation?
With respect to Hamas, that's a very tough question. But until we get all the Palestinians involved, we probably will not have a reliable peace. Now, I was very glad to see that the current administration is beginning to reach out to Hamas through the Egyptians, and that may be the right route to go, because they're very difficult to deal with, and peace with half the Palestinians is not going to be very stable.
But on the other hand, it's not an unreasonable proposition to say that a party to a negotiation should accept the existence of the other party.
Of course, I agree with you completely. That's why it's tough.
Let me suggest a way around that conundrum. In 1991, as we began to look at the possibility of convening an international conference to deal with the Arab-Israeli problem, we did not speak to the Palestine Liberation Organization. It was a terrorist organization. I never had one meeting as Secretary of State with Yasser Arafat. Madeleine kissed him, but we wouldn't do that. But we were foreclosed.
It's a brief romance.
But it was a very short romance. Yeah. But we were foreclosed from doing that So what did we do? We found some Palestinians from within the territories who were not officials of the PLO, but who supported the PLO and who, in fact, took their marching orders from the PLO and Yasser Arafat. We did this with the concurrence and approval of our Israeli friends. It was a construct that gave deniability to all the parties, and we ended up getting all of Israel's Arab neighbors to come to the table for the first time ever to negotiate peace with her. And I think something like that might work today.
I can't
Go ahead.
let this go. One of the things that distinguished me from all of you is that I did develop the art of diplomatic kissing, you know. But the bottom line, though, is that
Jesse Helms and others.
You're right. But we were not able to deal with the PLO until you, Jim, were able, in fact, to bring them in, and then Chris, we were able to bring some result to the Palestinians dealing with the Israelis. I think that we need to be much more supportive of Mahmoud Abbas. He and Salman Fayyad, the Prime Minister, are people that are trying to deal with the issue, and they need to be able to show that they can deliver.
Well, what do you mean by much more supportive?
I think
we're already
economically,
supporting them.
they have to show that democracy can deliver to them. And part of the reason that Hamas did as well as it did in the elections in Gaza was that they were performing constituency services and giving various things, job creation, the economic aspects of Annapolis. I was in the Middle East right after Annapolis, and everybody was very excited about it. The question is whether the pledges that have been made, whether there really has been a way to work through what that process was promising. People would love to see that happen. And I think that the question is how to use some of the ideas that Jim has just stated, or what Chris was saying with the Egyptians, because there has to be some way to break this logjam. But I don't think we should give up on Mahmoud Abbas.
I kissed Arafat, too.
You kissed Democrat?
On the back yet, baby.
That is
For the benefit of those in the audience, this is a very, very typical Middle Eastern way of greeting somebody. And we tried hard in the first months of the administration to get something started. And I met with Chairman Arafat a number of times. And to be blunt, he couldn't deliver. He would look you right in the eye and say, I will do exactly what you have said, General. You're a general, I'm a general, I will obey. And as soon as I left the room, I knew it was just more nonsense. And so we concluded in June of 2002 that this was not sustainable, and the President made his famous speech in June of 2002, which said, we need more and new responsible leadership. And they responded to that, and that's how Mahmoud Abbas has become now President, first Prime Minister, now President. But you have to be engaged. You have to find a way to deal with Hamas. Hamas was elected as a result of an election we insisted upon. A lot of people saying you don't want to do this.
And that many regard as something that backfired.
We put them in political power.
We made them do it.
Made them do it. And so you have to find clever ways to talk to them. Dr. Kissinger's reservations about talking to Hamas, somebody who's dedicated to the destruction of Israel, requires a response of the kind that Jim talked about. You get a cutout, maybe not just with the Egyptians, but with some Europeans who might be able to do it. It has to be done.
I would be remiss if I let this go by without going back to something you mentioned at the very beginning, which was the situation in Afghanistan. I think it needs some definition from people with your experience of what you believe the U.S. end goal should be in Afghanistan. Is it to eliminate al-Qaeda and the Taliban? Is it to establish a democracy? Is it to rebuild a nation? Is it all of the above? What is it, and what should it be for the next president? Secretary Kissinger?
You know, you're not obliged to start with me.
That was Hillary Clinton's complaint in a recent debate.
You know, I find Afghanistan intellectually tougher than Iraq. I can describe, and in a way the Baker report has described, what an outcome might be. When you say make Afghanistan democratic, Afghanistan has been an independent country governed by various warlords balancing their domains and their jurisdictions and uniting primarily when some foreign invader came in and making life very hard for them. We were involved in Afghanistan originally in the war because Al-Qaeda's headquarters and training operation was in Afghanistan. So we have a national interest in preventing this from arising again. So should Iran, because Al-Qaeda was threatening Iran. So should Pakistan. So should Russia. So should China. I must tell you frankly, I don't know exactly what to do in Afghanistan, except that I do not believe it is possible to democratize Afghanistan through a military operation, and that I would be content with creating a stable situation which its neighbors are willing to sustain, and in which everybody agrees that the fundamentalist Islamic group will be suppressed.
You are suggesting that stability should not be a dirty word. It can be an objective in foreign policy.
It's, I think, the only objective we can reach in the short term or in the medium term in Afghanistan.
Secretary Powell.
In some ways, I think, as does Henry, that Afghanistan is going to be more difficult in the long run than Iraq.
That's what I think.
Iraq is a country that used to have institutions. It has an educated middle class. It has an economic base that has to be restarted. Afghanistan is still driven mostly by tribal warlords, as they are called, and it is not going to be a Jeffersonian democracy in the lifetime of anybody in this room. So what do we want? Henry touched on it. Jim touched on it. We want stability and security and a good relationship with us. We have to do something to bring this about. Have to do something about the drug problem that is eating up the country, and something about banging down the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And you can't talk about stabilizing Afghanistan without talking about what's going on in Pakistan.
Well, precisely. And I indeed want to turn to that. Pakistan has faced significant violence and political turmoil in recent months, including the assassination, of course, of former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. So I wonder what advice you would give the next administration in dealing with Pakistan, and specifically the issue of President Musharraf. Secretary
Well, first of all, I think Pakistan contains everything that gives you an international migraine. It has nuclear weapons, it has poverty, extremism, corruption, and a lack of sense of where its democracy is going. And it is of concern also because it is a staging area, obviously, for dealing with Afghanistan. I think, though, what I find very supportive at the moment are the elections in Pakistan. I don't always agree that it has to be a Jeffersonian democracy, but there are signs that the people want to take a hold of it. And I see no reason why the U.S. shouldn't be supportive of that, which is different than imposing some kind of sense of democracy. I think the U.S. and the next president should align herself with the fact that there are, or himself, with the Pakistani people, and kind of a sense that the Pakistani people want to take their country back. It's a very complicated place, and all those migraine symptoms are there, but I think there is hope with Pakistan.
Do you think that the new Prime Minister of Pakistan should begin a dialogue with the militants?
Frankly, Jim, you know better than I do even, is the fact that the military and some of the Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's people dealt with a lot of the militants. So there's a lot of cross-cutting issues, but I think they're going to have to start talking to them.
I thought it was interesting to see that they're suggesting they're going to do that, which is a new approach, and one that on its face would appear not to appeal to us, but it may have some utility. I don't know, but I agree with everything Madeleine said. I think we ought to continue to do what we can to encourage the PACs to fight al-Qaeda and the Taliban in every way they can, because they will not get their country back if it ends up being turned over to that kind of government.
And with a figure like President Musharraf, what do you do? The United States has invested a tremendous amount of capital, political and otherwise, in this figure, and yet, as Secretary Albright suggests, his leadership days may be limited.
I think we have to act with a fairly light touch with respect to Pakistan.
I mean, we're talking about what a new president.
But a light touch is absolutely
we have
right.
to have a light touch, because
a light touch.
A light touch in the sense that I don't think we can tell the Pakistanis what to do with Musharraf, or they should or should not negotiate with the militants. The Pakistanis are going to decide that within their system, their new system. And frankly, if we start trying to lecture them and telling them what to do, I think that could well backfire. Let's also remember the history of Pakistan, that every time they have gone back to a, quote, democratic civilian-type government, it's come apart within a few years, and we're back to a military dictatorship.
No elected government has ever gone to the end of its term, because there's been so much corruption, so we shouldn't celebrate too soon. I agree that we should not try to manage the domestic affairs of Pakistan. Yes, these elections are democratic. We shouldn't particularly intervene in how they evolve, but it's going to be a very complicated situation, because they have nuclear weapons. They have an immediate impact on Afghanistan. They have an impact on India, China. So we have to understand what we mean by stability there, as well as by democracy.
I think, and Madeleine made this point also, I think it is perhaps the most dangerous single country situation that the new president is going to face, because it is at the crossroads of terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and has a history of the nature you've pointed out, Henry, and also has a history of having fought wars with India over the last 50 years, maybe how many, 3 or 4? Yeah.
Well, that's the question. What should a new administration do in terms of dealing with India, its neighboring nuclear power?
It turns out that we have a very good relationship with India right now as a result of the work of a number of people sitting here at this panel. And in the last couple of years, India has watched what's been happening in Pakistan and in Afghanistan and have not reacted the way they might have in past years. So I think we have a more mature stable
Although I'm
relationship.
sure they continue to watch every move keenly. Secretary Kissinger?
I think the relation with India is one of the very positive things that is happening. And it's based in part because they are the world's largest democracy. But India is very concerned about the impact of radical Islam. They have the second largest Islamic population in the world, 160 million. And they know that if the Islamic world becomes largely fundamentalist and radical, it will spill over. So their objectives are very similar to us. No major power control in that area, no radical Islamic domination. And so we can cooperate with them both on ideological grounds and on strategic grounds. And it's one of the positive legacies that the new administration will inherit.
Let's turn, if we may, to developments in Russia, where President Putin is Prime Minister Putin. How should the next administration address Russia and this new configuration?
I think we ought to begin to see if we can't encourage some independence on behalf of the new president, Medvedev. There's just a little flicker that he might be willing to move away from Putin. That's one thing that we should probe in a new president.
Willing? Do you think he's able?
Medvedev?
To move away or show independence of?
I think it's doubtful that he is. I think Putin is stronger. But more important, whoever is running Russia, and probably Putin will be running Russia, I think it's essential for us to try to restore our nuclear dialogue with them. That's really fallen into the abyss. START has really stopped, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is really stalled, virtually dead in the Senate. The questions as to civil rights concerns, those are very tough, but we ought to keep those on the table. If they are going to be part of the G8, and if they are going to be part of the European Union or the WTO, that we ought to demand from them the same kind of qualities and qualifications that we've demanded of others for entry into those bodies.
This whole issue of nuclear proliferation, of course, was addressed in part by the Nunn-Lugar efforts to reduce the stockpiles. Where does that stand, and does it need renewed attention from a new president?
Well, I believe that it is important to look at a zero-based world in terms of nuclear missiles. I think it's very hard to get to, but I think it is very important to have it as an agenda. I am very concerned that President Putin, doesn't matter where he sits, will continue to have a great deal of power, and that the Russians are playing a very dangerous game in terms of their oil diplomacy, or whatever one calls it, blackmail. But we have to be very careful about what we put on the agenda with the Russians. We need them on certain issues in terms of how to deal with Iran, for instance, or North Korea. And so we shouldn't load it down with issues that complicate our lives and are unnecessary, such as radar stations. And in Kosovo, well, we may disagree on that. But I think that it is very important for us to be clear about where we can cooperate and where we have to stand up for what we believe in.
In terms of Russia, the advice to the new president can be very simple. We need the best possible relationship we can have with Russia. Madeleine pointed out why we need Russia. We're going to really need Russia if we're going to ever deal with Iran's nuclear problem. We confronted them throughout the entire period of the Cold War, and it wasn't the end of Western civilization as we know it. We ought to understand Russia's going to have her own foreign policy interests. She's going to assert her views, and where they conflict with our vital interests, we ought to confront them. When we can cooperate with it, we ought to cooperate.
Can I
yes, sir.
make a point? One has to understand, I believe, that Russia is a country that has had a nervous breakdown. Here is a country that has lost 300 years of its history. It's not just the communist period. Everything for which they struggled and fought from the time of Peter the Great, they're right back to where they started. So that creates a tremendous problem for their leadership of how to give that country an identity. Then they have a long frontier with China, which is a sort of a demographic nightmare, because there are 30 million Russians on one side and 1 billion plus Chinese on the other. They have 25 million Muslims, about a fourth of their population right at that Islamic frontier. And then they have the new border with Europe, for which they have no historic experience. So they're trying to find a new identity. Now, with respect to Putin, there's sort of an obsession in this country about Putin as a person. My view is that if he wanted to be dictator, he's chosen a really tough way to do it. Because the easy thing for him to do would have been to amend the Constitution, since he controls the Parliament anyway, and give himself another term. He's now brought in somebody as president, and he's prime minister. The position of prime minister is constitutionally below the president. I have yet to meet a Russian who can explain to me how this thing it's going to work. This is not a very strong country. Their population is declining. They have a horrible health problem. They have huge tasks domestically. And we should keep open the possibility of a constructive relationship, because between them and us, we have 95% of the nuclear weapons in the world. On missile defense, I think we should explore that proposal of linking the radar systems that they made. At any rate, we should keep open the possibility of a constructive dialogue and not focus it on one man.
Secretary Powell.
Just 2 quick points. One, the Russian Federation is never going to be the Soviet Union again. They're doing too well by not being the Soviet Union. Right. They've never seen this level of wealth creation in their entire history. And so we shouldn't have that kind of fear that we're going back to the past. We're not. And the other thing we better remember is we sort of criticize Putin or Medvedev. They are enormously popular. Yeah. They have brought a sense of respect and stability back to the Russian people. And Putin didn't have to suppress the media or fiddle with the election. He would have been elected under even the Florida caucus system or something like that.
Well, prosperity is a popular political platform.
Popular.
You know.
I think what is interesting, though, because Colin is absolutely right, the question is why they figured they had to fiddle with the election, and why do they have to eliminate any opposition voice? So I think there are a lot of interesting questions about it.
Let me move us, however, to the east, China. Give us your perspective, if you will, of China today and how a new president and a new administration should address this relationship. Secretary
Well,
Baker.
I think, as we discussed with respect to Russia, I think we ought to cooperate with them when our interests are similar. We have similar interests with respect to North Korea's effort to obtain nuclear weapons, to the issue of global climate change, with respect to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, with respect to energy demands and security of energy supply. And we have differences with them in areas such as Taiwan and human rights. A little bit of a difference with them with respect to their military buildup. And there's a lot of news coverage today of what's happening in Tibet. There are a lot of people out there who would suggest that somehow the United States and China are inevitably on a collision course, and there's going to be an inevitable clash. I don't happen to believe that. I think we could make it happen. That would be a terrible, terrible mistake.
Secretary Christopher.
I think the country is really indebted to Secretary Kissinger for having found the opening to China. I think we benefited enormously from that, Henry, and I think we ought to continue on that path. One thing I would say that I found useful to remember when I was dealing with China, and that is that we have vastly different political systems. Our system, for all of its faults, depends upon the consent of the governed. In China, that kind of consent is really a hollow concept. They depend upon domination. And that makes them very highly sensitive to any indication of dissent. The Internet is going to make it much, much harder for them to maintain the kind of control that they think they need.
I've got to turn to the man who went to China, 30-plus years ago to achieve that opening.
One fundamental thing to say about these 3+ decades is that it is the most consistent bipartisan American foreign policy. Mm-hmm. One point I want to make is when we discuss foreign policy, we as Americans have a tendency to think of our concerns and then to make a sort of a catalog of what we would consider important. But we also have to look at the Chinese side. Here is a country with a long uninterrupted history of self-government, and that now, with all its apparent achievements, faces huge problems. They have a coastline that is like Europe and an interior that's in a very underdeveloped state. Mm-hmm. They have cities that have huge infrastructure problems. At any one moment, they have 100 million people moving from the interior. So this is not a country that now can undertake international adventures. I want to support what Jim and Madeleine have said. We should not look at China as a military adversary. It's not conceivable to me in a generation that could happen.
Secretary Powell, on the issue of whether or not China poses a present or future military threat,
I cannot come up with a scenario where China would find it in its interest to in any way be aggressive towards the United States. They don't have that kind of history or tradition, and they're doing so well by not being in a hostile situation with the United States of America. 2 points, if I may. China's major problem, and they'll tell you, is pollution and all the other things we've touched on. But they still have close to 900 million to 1 billion people who have not benefited in the slightest from this wealth creation. Right. They know it. And those people are getting mad. And China knows that what they have to do is to continue to industrialize, to get these people off those farms where they are subsistence peasant farmers and will never do any better. And that requires political stability with the West and especially political and economic stability with the United States of America. One final point, and I'll be brief. The last 3 countries we really touched on, India, China, and the Russian Federation, the old Soviet Union, they were my adversaries for most of my adult life. And now these are the only 3 countries really in the world that have the industrial or population capacity to challenge the United States as a peer militarily. And none of them are the slightest bit interested in doing this because they're doing so well in a new kind of world. So the new president is not just facing the usual horrible list of old problems left by the previous administration. He'll have his own new problems, but I think the new president will also have great opportunities to make it a better world.
Right. I want to just ask Secretary Albright how you address the emission of greenhouse gases from China. How do you reach an understanding that they can live with in terms of economic development of their country and that we and the rest of the world can live with? Well, I mean that quite literally, live with.
Well, it's obviously one of the most difficult issues, and for anybody that's been to China recently, it is difficult to breathe, and I don't make a lot of predictions, but I think the Chinese will win most of the medals at the Olympics because nobody else will be able to. But the bottom line, I think, is that we need to look at is energy deficit, basically, and that a lot of its foreign policy is based on trying to get energy supplies. And the question is whether we can persuade them that economically they will be better off if they leapfrog the mistakes that we have made on clean technology, and to bring them along so that they see that they're gaining out of it, instead of the arguments that they make, which is we're trying to stop them from developing by saying you can't use your industrial strength the way that we did in the past. Right. But it is a difficult position, and it has to be appealed to on the basis of that they are the ones that are suffering from environmental degradation of what Colin and Jim were talking about.
I want to ask a final question that is very dear to the mission of the Southern Center, and I think important to all of us. And that's whether or not today's citizens are getting the education they need in geography, world history, politics, economics, culture, languages, in order for this country to succeed and take a sophisticated approach to its role in the world. What do we do about educating this traditionally insular continental country, and its youth especially, about the rest of the world?
We have a challenge on how to handle the economic growth that's taking place all over the world. We have a challenge on how to handle the energy issue associated with that growth. We have a challenge on how to protect our environment when we see this economic growth and the energy needed for that growth. But the other problem we have is that we 300 million Americans have got to do a better job of educating our youth. Mm-hmm. And we in this country right now are seeing 1/3 of all of our youngsters not finishing high school. Yeah. We are seeing 50% of our minority kids not finishing high school. And we have accepted this. The greatest universities in the world, but the K-12 system is in desperate need. And I'm telling you, when you look at India, when you look at Russia, when you look at Eastern Europe, when you look at Latin America, all of these places that used to be isolated behind curtains or in totalitarian regimes, they're now all investing in education. And so America had got to get back to the task of educating our youngsters for a 21st century world.
Final. We've come to the end of our program, and I would like very much to thank Secretaries Kissinger, Baker, Powell, Christopher, and Albright for their participation in this Southern Center for International Studies conference. I'd also like to thank the sponsors for helping make the program possible. Last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you, our audience. I'm Terence Smith. Thank you all very much.
This program was produced by the Southern Center for International Studies, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding for this program was provided by the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, the Dean Rusk Center at the University of Georgia School of Law, Dr. Jerome Tannenbaum and DSI Facility Development, and the Center for International Governance Innovation. Additional funding was provided by these contributors. For a DVD or transcript of this program, please call 1-800-261-5763. For more information about this program and other educational materials, visit our website at southerncenter.org.